UFC 303 just ended with another highlight reel knockout from Pereira over Jiri Prochazka. And in this video, we're going to take a closer look at some fight knockout anatomy here, talk about what happened at the end of the first round, kind of how they managed to get Jiri back, and possible for a foot injury here with Poatan. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer. My goal in this channel is to teach you about the medical side of the sports world. We're on the road again, so bear with me for the mobile studio. We're going to take a look at some fight anatomy and reactions to the crazy knockout we just saw at 303. We're going to highlight a few things in particular about Pereira's anatomy here, specifically what he's able to do to generate that rapid knee extension to ultimately deliver that kick. We'll talk about how he maintains his balance, kind of how he preloads those hip flexors and that quad muscle, plus the anatomy of what actually makes contact on Prochazka and why Poatan could have a potential foot injury. But first, let's go back to the end of the first round. This was the end of the first round when we saw Jiri get dropped. And I think the reason why this didn't knock him out or affect him further was because we really didn't see a sudden jarring or that rapid acceleration, deceleration of the head when this punch came in. It was almost like Prochazka's whole body just kind of got shifted rather than this sudden rapid rotational force put through the head and then therefore to the brain. We certainly do, as the punch comes in, we see initially how Jiri's head is stationary. We see that shift, but it's not as violent of a rotation like we'll see other times, because remember, when that impact comes in, the skull is moving, the brain is then trying to catch up, that energy is being transferred into the brain tissue from external out through the skull. And so depending on how rapid that rotational force can be, that can send more energy down to the brainstem, potentially have a more serious effect in terms of knockout power, as opposed to this. It seemed like Prochazka's neck muscles were able to stabilize a little bit better to keep him from going completely unconscious, but I do think it affected him going into that next round. We'll touch on the old fingers up the nose trick here and what they're doing to try and kind of revive him. But first, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of today's video. Today's video is sponsored by IPVanish. If you're frustrated by limited access to certain websites, depending on what geography or where you're located, then IPVanish is perfect for you. It gives you access to an unrestricted internet, privately and securely. With apps for Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, and Amazon Fire TV, you can have unrestricted, safe, and private access to all of your favorite websites, regardless of where you are around the world. Their network is secured with advanced encryption standards that have been independently verified, and they don't keep any user logs of what you've been doing. I know my viewers are going to love all the capability with sports streaming, so you can make sure you're not missing out on your favorite team's action by being in a different part of the world. Right now, you can try IPVanish risk-free for 30 days and save on an annual plan by going to ipvanish.com/BrianMD or clicking the link at the top of the description. Their app is top-notch, very simple, nice screen to allow you to connect to an optimal location that they recommend. Or if you want to be more specific, you can disconnect from that and go into individual country locations or even cities. So start browsing safer with more privacy and more access to the content you want to see by trying IPVanish today. Thank you again to IPVanish for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to our learning. So we saw right as Jiri got back to his corner at the end of the first round, how this kind of cut man just shoved his finger kind of right up in the nose. And there was some debate at a fight, I think it was boxing earlier on in the year, where there was question of like smelling salts when they asked, do you want me to wake you up? They're not using smelling salts here. What they're trying to do is just cause this noxious stimulus by pushing on the nose, trigger a lot of pain to help Jiri wake up. Another thing that will do, if you're, for example, in the hospital, you're trying to see if somebody's arousable or not, is you can do something called a sternal rub, where you just take your knuckles and you put them in the sternum of someone's chest and just rub really aggressively. And that's another good way to try to suddenly get someone to awake. And so if you don't want to have someone shove their finger up your nose, another thing they could do in the corner would just be a sternal rub and just rub on his sternum really hard. I don't really understand why they're putting an ice bag on the back of his head. That would be one question. Why not, where you're getting better circulation and potentially cooling that blood, or maybe where the impact came in as opposed to just the back of the head. But I do think that Jiri was affected to some degree. His reaction time was probably reduced because of that initial hit, even though it didn't culminate to the point of a full knockout. So now let's go back to this whole knockout sequence. And it all culminates with that energy being transferred from the ground up through the leg and into Pereira's foot, ultimately, of course, into the skull, the head of Prochazka, which led to the knockout. But I want you to look at the position here of Alex's upper body. We see how he's leaned backwards a little bit. There's this angle where he's got this angle here in his trunk. And if we back up where that all actually started, that's going to contribute to this pre-tensioning, this preloading in those hip flexor muscles as he's able to swing his leg up to start this whole kick. So as he goes into this kick, this first move that he makes is actually that left leg moving backwards. So what he's doing as he moves that left leg backwards is he's going into a little bit of hip extension. Going into that hip extension is going to put some pre-tensioning, sort of pre-tighten that hip flexor muscle to then be ready to ultimately swing that left leg upwards to initiate that hip flexion to deliver the kick. And so that first subtle move of here he's in this position, that first move is putting that left hip backwards into that extended position to work on preloading it. He then gets some additional hip extension by leaning backwards. That's going to rotate his pelvis, putting even more kind of pre-tensioning on that iliopsoas hip flexor muscle before then he ultimately starts to bring that leg up forward into that first move, which is going to be hip flexion. So hip flexion is going to be when that thigh comes upwards, and hip extension is going to be when it goes backwards. So now he's in this hip flexed position, and I love here how you can see where his eyes are focused. His eyes are focused on his target, and at this point his knee is flexed, right? His knee is in a flexed position with it bent because his next move is going to be extending or kicking out that knee. Now the muscles that are going to extend the knee are going to be primarily those quadricep muscles. In fact, you can see the outline here of those quadricep muscles. So this one right here, this is going to be the rectus femoris that we're seeing outlined. On the outside here is going to be the vastus lateralis, and then on the inside, the vastus medialis. There's actually 4 different quadricep muscles that all contribute to firing, extending out, straightening out that knee, which allows that final delivery of power into the foot and then into the head of Prochazka, of course, leading to the knockdown. But just the stability, the balance that Pereira is able to maintain here just shows his elite athleticism and skill. As we go through this whole sequence, there's no movement in that knee. I mean, his leg stays in a perfectly stable position because you're trying to minimize loss of force. If everything's moving, you dissipate that energy, you dissipate that force quicker. So he's able to stay nice and stable, delivering maximal impact at the terminal end of that kick. Now we saw afterwards how he was adjusting and kind of messing with his foot. And I think there is a possibility here that he could have broken a bone in his foot. The top of his foot is coming in square flush on the skull of Prochazka, and that can easily cause a fracture to any of those dorsal or top bones in the midfoot or the toes. And so something to keep an eye on here going forward. Hopefully he didn't have any fracture in his foot, because depending on where it could be, especially if it's more the first metatarsal or the big toe bone, that can have a much longer recovery and not just be something like a pinky toe like we saw with McGregor. I will say too here at closeout, I do think the stoppage was late. And of course, some of the criticism at their first fight was that it was an early stoppage. And so I think that might've been going on in Herb Dean's head here. I think when Prochazka first went down, he did look like he was at least still maybe a little bit alert. It was, I think, that subsequent follow-up blow that finally put it out. So here, these last few blows, I think, were unnecessary. It was a little bit of a delayed stoppage, but I think if you're going to be in a title fight where they're coming off of question of an early stoppage, you've got to have a different threshold. And so I think in this case, I don't feel too particularly bothered by that stoppage maybe being a little bit later than we'd otherwise like to see. This is that part just before the kind of final word was announced where we see him grabbing at that first big toe, and he's kind of grabbing at specifically that first metatarsal bone. Anytime you have a foot fracture, if it's the first metatarsal, meaning the big toe, those are higher risk. Those are going to take longer to heal, more potential for surgery. And so I'm really hopeful that he didn't actually break that bone, because that could be something that would affect his training and might see him have a much longer delay. So to be determined, but that is just going to be from the direct contact. The top of the bone, there's not a lot of muscle. There's not that much fat tissue protecting that bone. It's just bone on bone hitting the skull, and certainly could have led to a significant injury. So that's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. I hope you all enjoyed another one of these kind of fight science breakdowns. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.